I take something responsibility.
Did you come especially for this? Did you come over especially for this?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Yes, I had some funds. I had the support of my university.
Yeah.
They had some funds, so they sent me over. I said I
When do you go back?
Friday. I'm here till Friday, so I get a chance to relax a little bit.
Especially after your presentation.
Right. Yeah. So I had an opportunity to do that. So.
Good. So are you ready to start then? 9 minutes past. If I start the introduction next minute, we're right?
Yes.
Okay, welcome everybody. My I want to say 3:10, and we'll be finishing in this room at 3:40 in time for us to go to the AGM at 3:45. That's my understanding. Okay, so I'm Dulcie Mackenzie for those of you who come into the room, and online, welcome. We are about to have a presentation, and we're going to introduce now and welcome David Childs from Northern Kentucky University, going back to USA on Friday, he just told me. And his presentation is called I Go Home with My Lord and Be Free, Eschatological Consciousness in Religious Thought of Enslaved African Christians in North America. David, over to you.
Thank you. I come from the lens of I'm a historian. I do Black church studies, so Black theology, and so keep that in mind as I present. I think I want to start off with a spiritual. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go up to my Lord and be free. No more weeping. Don't you know? No more weeping. No more weeping over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go up to my Lord and be free. The spiritual entitled, Oh Freedom, offers us a starting point to help us understand how the enslaved thought about life and death. Of this particular spiritual, Howard Thurman states, it is here that death is not regarded as life's worth offering. Death is the guarantee of the sense of alternative in human experience upon which, in the last analysis, all notions of freedom finally rest. Here is the recognition of death as the one fixed option which can never be taken from man by any power. The spirituals and other liturgical forms created by the enslaved Africans help us understand the sophisticated ways that the enslaved thought about death and the afterlife, that is, eschatology. The thesis of this paper, I should say also, this is a paper that I'm currently working on and drawn from my dissertation, drawn from a book chapter I did, a couple of different sources. And so I'm thinking through some things. But the thesis, drawing upon the lyrics, sermons, religious writings, and burial practices of the enslaved, this presentation interrogates the eschatological assumptions and deliberations of enslaved Africans and highlights the ways in which the Africans reasoned theologically about eternity, rest, Africa, divine retribution, and the destiny of the enslavers. I thought I would share with you some of my sources and who I'm drawing from, theological and conceptual framework of this paper. I should also mention my colleague, Dr. Eric Williams. We co-wrote this paper. We are co-writing this paper. He is from the Smithsonian Institute curator there at the African American History Museum, the newest museum as a part of this Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. He was not able to be here, so I neglected to say that at the beginning. So my work is drawn from, you folks have heard of James Cone, Black Theology in the Black Church. Where have we been and where are we going? And Black theology is social historical. It looks at, you cannot talk about the theology of the Black church, African American history, Black theology without looking at the history. And that's what drew me as a historian. I've had some theological training, but I teach actually in the history department in the College of Education at Northern Kentucky University. And I'm also a pastor by vocation. And the historical piece should not be neglected. And you may have heard of Albert Robichaux out of Princeton, Enslaved Religion, the Invisible Institution. He has much to say about the Black church, the invisible institution. And one of the things he said that I find interesting, that I also, Howard Thurman says, that in some ways, Black Christianity is more authentic as it relates to the enslaved experience, because they are akin to suffering. And you may have heard of Cone's work, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, and which is fascinating because it links the suffering of Christ to the suffering of the enslaved. And then Howard Thurman's work, the Negro Spiritual, speaks of life and death. So this individual I've drawn from. So I spent the most time dealing with spirituals. So let us do some more analysis of spirituals that will help us get an understanding of slave eschatology. I thought, and we all are familiar with spirituals, but I thought I would just give us some more language in terms of what spirituals are all about, and just sort of give some definitions of spirituals. Spirituals encompass the sing songs, work songs, plantation songs, also known as Negro spirituals, spiritual music, African American spirituals, the genre of Christian music that is, quote, purely, solely the creation of generations of African Americans. Some people add the civil rights songs to the canon of spirituals. It emerged out of African cultural heritage with the experiences of being held in bondage in slavery. And I talked about sing songs, work songs, plantation songs that evolved into blues and gospel songs in church. In the 19th century, the word, quote unquote, spirituals referred to all these subcategories of folk songs. While they were often rooted in biblical stories, they also described the extreme hardships endured by African Americans who were enslaved from the 17th century until the 1860s. The emancipation altering mainly the nature but not continuation of slavery for many. Many new derivatives of music genres emerged from spiritual songcrafts. Howard Thurman of Spiritual notes, there were three main sources from which raw materials of Negro spirituals were derived: the Old and New Testaments, the world of nature and personal experience of religion that were common, that were common, a lot of people emerging from the inner life. So those three sources: the personal experience, the Old and New Testament, and their religious experience as well. Well, there's that quote there. I want to be ready. This is another spiritual. I want to be ready. I want to be ready. Walk in Jerusalem just like John. Oh, John, what do you say? Walk in Jerusalem just like John. I'll be meeting on the crowning day. Walk in Jerusalem just like John. I want to be ready. I want to be ready. I want to be ready. Walk in Jerusalem just like John. The reason I sing is because from an epistemological standpoint, we look at knowledge in a certain way. But for the enslaved, singing and music was a part of their epistemology, their understanding. And so it's difficult for me. I was just talking to the moderator, difficult for me to even articulate it without singing. So this particular spiritual is very fascinating because it talks about Jerusalem eschatologically and as an after. So the afterlife involves Jerusalem, and then they take John. They call John the Revelator, and they want to emulate John and experience those things because, of course, in slave life there was not always joy. Now I studied the notion of black joy. How many people have heard of the idea of black joy? Black joy is the body of research is been researched for a long time, but people are naming it. And when they study the African diaspora, they want to highlight positive things. Okay, so it's not to neglect the experience of the enslaved, but they might talk about the Harlem Renaissance. They might talk about spirituals. So I'm sort of in that tradition. And in this particular spiritual, they are identifying with John in the book of Revelation, in that, quote, crowning day. So it's at least twofold, because most importantly for those individuals, slavery would be over. Okay, death becomes a time, not that we dread, but I can be free. And so I want to be ready. It also invokes the piety, things I need to do in order to sort of earn heaven, that earn that reward of heaven. So I want to be ready. Whatever is involved in getting ready, being a good Christian, reading my Bible, etc. and so forth. King Jesus in his chariot rides, O my Lord, with 4 white horses side by side, O my Lord. And so we see another allusion to Revelations, the 4 white horses. This is another spiritual. And where else do we know the theme of chariots? Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for, carry me home. There's a reference to Elijah going home in the chariot. I love, that's one of my favorite biblical narratives because, and by the way, it's a prominent narrative in the black church. We see throws his mantle down, the very physical action of catching the mantle. That is so powerful. There's a lot of theological implications of that. Here's another one here. Brother, keep your lamp trimming in the burning. Keep your lamp trimming in the burning. Keep your lamp trimming in the burning, for this world most done. Now, the ones I've chosen are, I would say, heavily scripturally rooted. You can point right to where they received inspiration from Scripture. This is from Matthew 25. And you see that commonly. They were biblical literalists. Biblical literalists. That's in different understanding. They were biblical literalists. A biblical lyricist might be a hip-hop artist or something, a gospel rapper. In that great getting up morning, fare ye well, fare ye well. In that great getting up morning, fare ye well, fare ye well. Blow your trumpet, Gabriel, fare ye well, fare ye well. Oh, blow your trumpet, Gabriel, fare ye well, fare ye well. Lord, how loud shall I blow it? Fare ye well, fare ye well. Blow it right, calm and easy. Fare ye well, fare ye well. And then it talks about when you see the world on fire, look at all of the eschatological references. Getting up morning, the rapture, so-called rapture. Blow your trumpet, Gabriel. And they identified that with Gabriel. Gabriel was a prominent figure in many of the songs and also the sermons. How loud shall I blow it? A very practical aspect of it. Preacher, fold your Bible. fascinating image as a child. And by the way, we sang these songs as I was growing up in my church. And as I was doing this research, we sang so many songs, I never realized they were spirituals. Many of the songs that we sing, they're different iterations of it. That's the nature of spirituals as well. They keep evolving. But no longer need my Bible. I'm going to heaven. But this is the end times here. So this is more than just dying and going to heaven, but this is the coming of the Lord, the second coming. When you see the world on fire, another reference. In the interest of time, now analyzing sermons it's quite time consuming, so I'm just going to make a few references. I could do a whole talk on analyzing sermons. I'm going to reference a few folks. Richard Allen. Richard Allen was, as you folks know, among theologians, the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1816. The narrative goes that Richard Allen and a group of enslaved were at the white Episcopal Church, and they were praying in the wrong section. There was a section for the enslaved, and they dragged them off of their knees and moved them to the black section during prayer meeting. And they decided, we have to start our own church. This is ridiculous. And so that's how the AME Church was founded, African Methodist Episcopal Church. Richard Allen was the founder, the bishop, and he's probably one of those individuals that we have the most, some of the most profound writings. He wrote a whole sort of autobiography. And Richard Allen, his dates are 1760 to 1831. He says in one aspect of his narrative, sort of a sermon narrative, that section is called A Short Address to the Friends of Him Who Have No Helper. It says, I feel an inexpressible gratitude towards you who have engaged in the cause of the African race. You have wrought a deliverance for many from more than Egyptian bondage. So there's always this reference of the enslaver as the Egyptian, the enslaved as the biblical Israel. Your labors are unremitted for their complete redemption from the cruel subjection they are in. And so a lot of the preachers in those days, enslaved preachers, talked about redemption and divine retribution. Here's another passage from that same writing. Your righteous indignation is roused at the means taken to supply the place of the murdered baby. You see our race more effectually destroyed than was in Pharaoh's power. It almost seems like he's writing to what we would call today white allies, those that are coming to our aid. And he's sort of giving them thanks and saying, we appreciate that. But he makes a reference here. You blow the trumpet against the mighty evil. You make the tyrants tremble. And so there's that theme. The thing I want to point out primarily here is divine retribution from Richard Allen, amongst other things as it relates to eschatology. Nat Turner. So you folks have heard of Nat Turner. His dates are 1800 to 1831. He died when he was 31 years old. And Nat Turner says, when the Lord spoke to him, quote, I heard a loud noise in the heavens, and the Spirit instantly appeared to me and said, the serpent was loosened, and Christ had laid down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, that I should take it on and fight against the serpent. For the time was fast approaching when the first should be last, and the last shall be first. And so he saw from an eschatological standpoint, the rising of the enslaved. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. That in the end, the oppressed would win. And so that's a few references to enslaved preaching and sermons. This is fascinating too. The myth of the flying African. Flying Africans are figures of African diaspora. The legend talked about, the legend referred to escaped enslavement by a magical passage back over the ocean to Africa. It was believed that there was an escape passage. Because it was such a traumatic experience, they formulated these sort of coping mechanisms. Most noted in Gullah culture, they also occur in wider African folklore, and in that, some of African Caribbean peoples. So I just wanted to explain that. Eschatology and infanticide among enslaved women. The most popular example is Margaret Garner, who I live in that part of the country. Actually, I live in Kentucky. I live right by the river that she's crossed, the Ohio River, where that took place in a community that's close to where I live. And she, rather than have her child go into enslavement, she killed the child. There were other instances of that. And that's my time as, this is an example, another example, 1803, Igbo landing mass suicide. So just some concluding thoughts. Enslaved eschatology indicated that A, death was not feared, almost welcome. Their thinking was rooted in the notion of freedom and a better life. Their biblical literalism influenced their eschatology, and their writings bore a theme of divine retribution against enslavers. We must take seriously the contributions of Black theologians in the terrain of theological studies, especially as it relates to history. And other implications I make is for public school classrooms and theological education to infuse African-American thought and Black theology. This is actually a novel that I wrote that deals with enslavement and spirituals. So I wanted to make a reference to that as well. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, David. Excellent. I invite you to stop sharing the screen and join us here, and I'll move the camera so everyone online can hear and see you. And ask someone online just to double check that you can hear and see us.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Okay, great. So again, just online, we'll take questions from you. I'll ask you to put your hand up virtually, please, and that will signify to us that you have a question. And we'll ask you to verbalise your question if it's okay. And in the room, do we have any questions for David? We were blessed with singing and presentation. Wow. Hi, Selena.
Thank you so much for sharing that and seeing it. It's important to feel the songs, and we ask us to do that. My question is about how divine retribution is spoken about. I'm thinking if death isn't feared for enslaved African but welcomed, how is death understood in relation to oppressors and slavers, and what's the retribution of that?
That's very insightful. And that is what I was referring to in terms of divine retribution against the enslavers. And so what we have to imagine is, let's go back to the early 1800s when there was no talk of the Civil War. And so, in other words, there was no understanding of when freedom would take place. And so, from a theological standpoint, they always talked about at some point the enslaver is going to get here, so to speak. And you see that in a lot of the sermons. So what would it look like? Probably enslavers going to hell and having eternal punishment. And so their Christian theology, Black Christian theology, gave them the framework to think about that, to be brave enough to think about that. And the slaves, the spirituals were also songs of, they were weaponry. They were weaponized. And they talked a lot about retribution, and you might see me as an enslaved person now, but that's not how God sees me. And we have a greater judge higher than so-called Pharaoh, the slave catchers, the enslavers. We have a higher judge, and that's all connected to divine retribution. And when you look at the sermons, the analyzed sermons and go deeper into it, they talk about that quite a bit. And they were quite brave. David Walker's Appeal is a great example of the sort of divine retribution and how the enslavers would ultimately pay the price. So.
Another question from Anthony, then we'll come to you, Nash, online. Go on, Anthony, thank you.
So fantastic paper, thank you very much. So to what extent is this tradition you're speaking of? Is that an artifact that is very part of African American history, or is it very current in terms of being the material that, let's say, the Black Lives Matter and a hip hop generation would use. As kind of part one and then maybe kind of part two, it's often said that maybe part of the failure of Black Lives Matter to replicate civil rights is because they don't have their own songs that speak to the broader culture of interest kind of two parts.
But as a historian, that's how I think about things anyway. Nothing is ahistorical. And so the nature of spirituals is that they're always evolving anyway. The Western mind wants to set things to music. My wife's a classical pianist. They want to document things. You play that piano song exactly the way it looks on the sheet music. But spirituals are more Afrocentric. Sometimes talks about Afrocentric epistemology from an Afrocentric epistemology. That's not how things go. I can sit up here and sing the spirituals 10 different ways. And the Western mind will say, oh, that's incorrect, that's incorrect, that's incorrect. But to the African, there's no way of looking at that. But to get to your question, it's always evolving. And so you might have different iterations of the spirituals. Like, for example, we are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. And I've gone to church where they think like, we are climbing Jacob's ladder. So it's always evolving. And so it's the same thing intellectually. Where we have, for example, from a music standpoint, in terms of jazz, in terms of hip hop. And we can say the same thing intellectually. So one could argue that the Black Lives Matter movement is the new sort of civil rights movement. Or maybe it's not, maybe you don't even call it civil rights movement, maybe it's something else, but the essence of the spirit is still there from the theological standpoint. And so the spirituals are a great metaphor to help literally and figuratively help us understand that how ideas are evolving. So we stand on the shoulders of giants. Makes sense? Does that answer your question?
Let's take a question from Nash online before we have another question in the room. Can I ask you to unmute, Nash? I'm assuming that's your name, and share with us your question, please.
Hi, I am C.L. Nash. I'm in University of Edinburgh. I had a couple of questions, but one of my thoughts was that there's a sense of actualized eschatology that's largely overlooked. I wanted to know your thoughts about that. And I also had a question about slaves who willed themselves to die on slave ships. There are some slave narratives that talk about people actually being able to sort of do that, just had such mind control in what they thought they were observing. And how do you think this embrace of death figures into the eschatology of the enslaved? And is there a connection with the eschatology that you see in Black theology today?
Yes. The short answer is yes. And death is different. Views of death is different in the enslaved mind because the conditions were so undesirable. Death became freedom. Especially those in the 18th century that saw no hope of ever being free. Then your children were going to be enslaved, so legally, when you had children, they would be enslaved as well. And so that's how you also get infanticide. That's why people begin to do that. And so in terms of death, they viewed it, of course they dreaded it, but it was a mystery, but it was kind of a good thing because it was connected to their understanding of the hereafter. You ask your other question. Or can you ask, please?
Let's see, I'm sorry. I asked about the spirituals. Oh, as a song of movement, actually. You didn't say that. And then the sense of actualized eschatology, that's largely overlooked. By that, I'm thinking about things like Steal Away and songs that were used covertly to create movement, as opposed to simply one that embraced freedom through death. But there is also freedom through movement and escape of southern plantations.
And spirituals are, so I'm sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No,
I'm sorry, I just was ending by saying I was asking about your thoughts on that.
Spirituals are complex. They're not linear. And so to say that every spiritual had symbolism is a misnomer. I know that's an exotic thing to say, but some spirituals most of them were theological. They were liturgical forms. They were used in slave worship. And when we say slave worship, we're talking about brush arbor experiences or hush harbor, as it was called. They were unauthorized worship services, as we call it today, in the woods in some undisclosed location. And so a lot of times the spirituals were used in that context. And if you've been to I'll speak about the American Black church context. The sermon and the prayer and the songs are sort of merged. That's what I mean. That's very Afrocentric, and it's not linear. Where the Western mind would say, okay, this is our time to pray, this is our time to sing, this is our time to preach. I don't want to overstate that, but often they're merged together. That's very much a good way to understand Black theology, enslaved theology. But to get to your question, so that covert meaning in some ways, still a way, indicated one it was a good time to escape. Wade in the water was one of those dual references. But by and large, a lot of them were just, some were work songs, some were a way to draw closer to God, some were a way to learn scripture. So it was complex in that way. And yes, we see that today. We see it today. It has not stopped. It's continued. And so in my thinking, it's not something of the past. The past is having a conversation with the present. And it's who I am. It's my ontology. It's my epistemology. I think about this autobiographically.
Okay, thank you. We have literally 4 minutes to get to AGM. I'm going to invite you to raise your question and let's see if David can answer it in 30 seconds. If not, we'll have to have that conversation on the way to AGM.
I love it.
What's your question, please?
Thank you so much. It's wonderful and beautiful. Given the diversity of the spirituals that you have just discussed, it was connected with the double meaning of some of them. As a historian, have you seen any correlated, I guess, trends in theology, primarily by theologians that work in theological institutions, and the themes are coming up there about like retribution versus like universalism, right, or Gnosticism versus. I don't know if they historically that you're seeing any trends that were similar or different, but I was curious as you're talking about the different emphases of the spirituals that you're seeing.
If I can use this word, spirituals are syncretistic in terms of they emerge. It's a merging of white culture and Black culture. And hymns. In fact, particularly Methodism, early Methodism, not as we see it today, but early Methodism, they're appealing to African Americans, enslaved Africans, because they allow for emotion and they allow for expression. The Great Awakening revival and so forth were very attracted to enslaved folks because they allow freedom of expression. It's just like Pentecostalism today. And so there is this syncretism of races and culture. So when we study spiritually, we study American history, we study diasporic history, not just Black history, English history, American history, etc.
A wonderful place to end. David Charles, thank you very much. Excellent. Thank you online and thank you everybody. AGM 3:45 main auditorium. Thank you.
Thank you.